Silver Gulch, Colorado, 1879. The first snow of winter had begun to dust the pine-covered slopes of the San Juan Mountains when Sheriff Thomas Blackwood pushed open the door to Martha Holloway's cabin. The hinges groaned with a hollow, mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness within. A thin film of dust covered the simple wooden table, the two chairs arranged across from one another as if awaiting conversation that would never come. A pot hung above the cold hearth, tea leaves still visible at the bottom. "Just as we found it 3 days ago," said Deputy Warren Holt, his breath visible in the cold mountain air. "Nobody's been here since then. Food in the pantry, clothes in the wardrobe, Bible on the nightstand open to Psalms." Sheriff Blackwood moved deeper into the cabin, his weathered boots leaving prints in the fine dust. Something about this place felt wrong, not violated or disturbed, but abandoned in a way that defied explanation. Martha Holloway, widowed 2 years prior when her husband James died in a mine collapse, had been a fixture in Silver Gulch since the settlement's earliest days. "Her horse is still in the stable," the sheriff noted, studying a silver-framed daguerreotype on the mantel, Martha in her younger days, standing beside her husband. "No tracks leading away from the property that haven't been accounted for." "It's as if she just vanished," Deputy Holt whispered, removing his hat as though standing in a graveyard. The sheriff ran a finger along the table's surface. "Neighbors say they heard her talking to someone the night before she disappeared." He paused, his voice lowering. "But nobody saw anyone approach the cabin." In the corner of the room stood Martha's prized possession, a cherrywood secretary desk inherited from her grandmother. Sheriff Blackwood carefully pulled open the central drawer, finding a leather-bound journal inside. The last entry was dated October 17th, just 5 days ago. "I hear him again tonight. James is calling to me from the canyon. The others don't believe me, think grief has addled my mind. But a wife knows her husband's voice. He says he's found something in the old whispering mine, something that shouldn't be there, something that's been waiting. Tomorrow I'll follow his voice to where the canyon narrows. I'm not afraid." The sheriff closed the journal slowly. "We need to check the whispering mine." Deputy Holt shook his head. "That mine's been abandoned for nearly 10 years, since that whole section of the mountain was deemed unstable. Holloway was the last foreman before they closed it." He hesitated. "Folks say that place is cursed, that you can hear voices in there, the men who died when the lower shaft collapsed." Through the cabin's single window, the sheriff could see the mountains beyond, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised more snow. Somewhere in those ancient formations was the entrance to the whispering mine, and perhaps the answer to Martha Holloway's disappearance. "Get the horses ready," the sheriff said, tucking the journal into his coat. "And find someone who knows the path to that mine. We're leaving at first light." As they stepped out of the cabin, Sheriff Blackwood turned to lock the door, a peculiar instinct given that the owner was missing. In that moment, both men would later swear they heard something, a faint, indistinct whisper that seemed to emanate not from the cabin, but from the distant canyon that cut through the mountains like an ancient wound. The sheriff's hand froze on the key. "Did you—" "I didn't hear anything," Deputy Holt interrupted too quickly, his face pale in the fading light. But they had heard it. A woman's voice, carried on the wind, too distant to discern words but unmistakably human. Unmistakably Martha. Sheriff Blackwood looked toward the mountains once more, the peaks now completely obscured by darkness and snow. "We leave now. Get the lanterns. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You'll want to be subscribed to hear the rest of Martha's haunting tale and discover what ancient secrets hide in the abandoned whispering mine." The snow-laden wind cut through the riders' heavy coats as they followed the narrow trail that wound up the mountain slope. Sheriff Blackwood led the way, followed by Deputy Holt and their reluctant guide, Silas Tucker, a grizzled miner who'd worked the whispering mine in its final days. "Never should have agreed to this," Silas muttered, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "That place ain't natural. Saw good men lose their minds down there, hearing things that weren't there." "You knew Martha Holloway's husband?" the sheriff asked, guiding his horse around a patch of ice. Silas nodded, his beard crusted with frost. James Holloway was a good man, practical, not the kind to believe in ghost stories, until he started hearing them too. He adjusted his scarf against the cold, started claiming there was another level below the main shaft, one that wasn't on any of the maps, said he could hear singing coming from down there. And did anyone check? Deputy Holt asked. The collapse happened before they could, Silas replied. 7 men lost, including Holloway. They sealed the mine after that, said the whole structure was compromised. By midday, they reached a plateau half hidden by pine trees. The entrance to the Whispering Mine stood before them, its timber supports weathered and sagging. A sign hung askew across the entrance. Condemned, no entry. This is as far as I go, Silas said firmly, remaining mounted. I'll wait here, but if you ain't back by sundown, I'm riding for town. The sheriff and his deputy dismounted, securing their horses before approaching the mine entrance. The dark opening seemed to swallow the daylight, a perfect void against the white snow. You don't have to come, Blackwood told his deputy. Holt hesitated only briefly. With respect, Sheriff, I didn't take this badge to wait outside when things get unnerving. Together, they lit their lanterns and stepped into the darkness of the Whispering Mine. The temperature dropped immediately, but it wasn't just the cold that made both men shiver. There was a weight to the silence here, a pressure that seemed to push against their eardrums. The main tunnel extended straight into the mountain, support beams placed at regular intervals, some now rotting and precarious. Their lanterns cast long shadows that danced along the rough-hewn walls. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing strangely. According to Martha's journal, the sheriff said, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. She believed her husband was calling to her from inside this mine. 2 years after his death, Deputy Holt whispered incredulously. Grief can do strange things to a person's mind, Blackwood replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced of his own explanation. They continued deeper, passing abandoned carts and tools, frozen in time since the day the mine was sealed. About 500 yards in, they reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 separate paths. Which way? Holt asked. Before the sheriff could respond, they both froze. From the rightmost tunnel came a sound, so faint it might have been imagination, but both men heard it clearly. A woman's voice, singing a melody without words. Martha? Sheriff Blackwood called out, his voice bouncing off the stone walls and returning to them distorted and strange. The singing stopped abruptly. Deputy Holt's hand moved instinctively to his holstered revolver. Sheriff, I don't like this one bit. Blackwood raised his lantern higher. This way, he said firmly, turning toward the right tunnel. The passage narrowed as they proceeded, the ceiling dropping so low in places that they had to duck their heads. The air grew thinner, staler, carrying a mineral smell that burned their nostrils. And then something else, a sweet cloying scent that neither man could identify. Look there, Holt said suddenly, pointing ahead where the tunnel appeared to end in a cave-in. As they approached, they saw that the collapse wasn't total. There was a narrow opening at the top, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. And around this opening, scratched into the stone in a desperate hand, were words, "He is not James." "Dear God," whispered Holt. "Martha was here." Sheriff Blackwood examined the collapsed section more closely. These rocks have been moved recently. Someone cleared this path deliberately. He raised his lantern to the opening and peered through. Beyond was a chamber that wasn't on any of the mine's original maps, a natural cavern that the mining operation had inadvertently broken into. The sheriff could see just enough to make out strange, smooth walls that didn't look like natural stone formation. "I'm going through," he stated, already removing his heavy coat. "Sheriff, please," Holt protested. "We should get more men, proper equipment. If Martha came this way, she's been in there for days without food or water," Blackwood replied. "We don't have time." Without waiting for further argument, the sheriff handed his lantern to Holt and began squeezing through the narrow opening. The rough stone scraped against his clothes, threatening to trap him, but with a final push, he broke through into the chamber beyond. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. The sheriff stood frozen, his boots rooted to the stone floor of a chamber that defied all explanation. Unlike the rough-cut tunnels of the mine, this space was perfectly circular, its walls smooth and covered in symbols that resembled no language he had ever seen. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. "Sheriff? What do you see?" Deputy Holt's voice came muffled through the opening. Blackwood couldn't find words to respond. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, ancient and worn by time. Surrounding it in a perfect circle were 7 tall, chair-like structures carved from the same smooth stone as the walls. And in one of these chairs sat a figure, motionless, facing away from him. "Martha?" he called softly, his voice absorbed by the strange acoustics of the chamber. The figure didn't move. Sheriff Blackwood stepped forward cautiously, the sound of his boots echoing strangely. As he approached, he noticed something peculiar about the floor. Thin channels had been carved into it, radiating out from the central altar like the spokes of a wheel, each leading to one of the stone chairs. When he was just a few steps from the seated figure, he raised his lantern higher. "Mrs. Holloway?" The figure turned then, with a slowness that seemed inhuman. The light fell across Martha Holloway's face, her skin ashen, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips moving in silent words. She looked at the sheriff without recognition, without any indication that she perceived him at all. "Martha, it's Sheriff Blackwood. I've come to take you home." Her lips stopped moving, her head tilted slightly, like a curious bird. "Home," she repeated, the word hollow and strange. "There is no home now, only the voices. They've been here so long, waiting in the mountain." Her eyes focused suddenly, with an intensity that made the sheriff step back. "I followed James's voice, but it wasn't James. They can make any voice they choose." "Who, Martha? Who are these voices?" Blackwood asked, fighting the urge to retreat. Martha smiled, a terrible, empty expression. "The ones who were here before the town, before the settlers, before the native peoples. They've been sleeping in the stone, waiting for someone to listen." She reached out a trembling hand, pointing to the altar. "Look what they showed me." On the altar's surface lay an object that the sheriff had initially mistaken for a natural formation. A crystalline structure about the size of a man's fist, clear as glass but with something swirling inside it. Something that moved and shifted like smoke, but seemed to catch the light in impossible ways. "They call it the heart," Martha whispered. "It's been beating here for thousands of years, listening to the mountain, speaking to those who can hear." Sheriff Blackwood felt a cold that had nothing to do with the mine's temperature. "Martha, you're not well. You've been without food or water. Let me take you back to town, to Dr. Merritt." "I've never been more well," she replied, her voice suddenly stronger. "I've never been more certain. They've shown me what's coming, Sheriff, what's always been coming." She stood from the stone chair, moving with an unnatural grace. "Would you like to hear it too? Just one whisper, and you'll understand." The sheriff took another step back, his hand moving to his gun. "Mrs. Holloway, I must insist." "Sheriff," Deputy Holt's voice echoed from the opening. "Are you all right in there?" Martha's expression changed at the sound of the deputy's voice, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. For an instant, she looked like herself again, a widow from Silver Gulch, lost and afraid. "Help me," she whispered, her voice her own again. "They won't let me leave. Not until I bring others to listen." "I'm getting you out of here," Blackwood said firmly, reaching for her arm. The moment his fingers touched her sleeve, a sound filled the chamber, a terrible, discordant whispering that seemed to come from the very walls. The crystalline object on the altar pulsed with an inner light, the swirling within it moving faster. Martha's face contorted in pain. "No, you don't understand. If I try to leave without completing their purpose, they'll—" She gasped suddenly, her back arching. Her next words came as a desperate plea. "Run, Sheriff! Run now!" The whispering grew louder, resolving into distinct voices, hundreds of them, overlapping, speaking words in languages that had no right to exist in this world. The sheriff stumbled backward as Martha fell to her knees, clutching her head. "I'm not leaving without you," he insisted, reaching for her again. "Then you'll never leave at all," she replied, but the voice was no longer Martha's alone. Something else spoke through her, something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. The sheriff made a decision then, driven by instinct more than reason. He lunged forward past Martha's kneeling form, toward the altar and the crystalline object upon it. If this was the source of the voices, perhaps removing it would break whatever hold it had on Martha. As his fingers closed around the crystal, two things happened simultaneously. The whispering stopped as abruptly as if a door had been slammed, and Martha Holloway screamed, a sound of such pure anguish that it would echo in Thomas Blackwood's nightmares for decades to come. Then the ground beneath them began to tremble. "The mountain awakens," Martha said, her voice eerily calm amid the growing chaos. "You shouldn't have touched it, Sheriff. Now they know you can hear them too." Dust and small stones began to rain from the ceiling as the trembling intensified. "Sheriff!" Holt shouted from beyond the opening, panic evident in his voice. "The tunnel's starting to collapse. We need to leave now." Blackwood looked from the crystal in his hand to Martha's resigned face. "I'm getting you out of here," he stated, gripping her arm firmly. To his surprise, she didn't resist as he pulled her toward the opening where Holt waited. The deputy helped them through, first Martha and then the sheriff, who kept the crystal clutched tightly in his hand, unwilling to leave it behind. The three of them ran through the increasingly unstable tunnel, dodging falling debris as the entire mine seemed to shudder around them. They reached the junction where the tunnel split, but found the main passage partially blocked by a fresh collapse. "This way!" Holt shouted, pointing to a narrower side tunnel. "This might connect to the old ventilation shaft. It could lead to the surface." They had no choice but to follow, even as Martha kept repeating, "They won't let us leave. They won't let us leave." The crystal in the sheriff's hand had grown strangely warm, and he could swear he felt it pulsing against his palm like a tiny heart. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them to proceed in single file, bent almost double. The sound of the mine collapsing behind them was deafening now, pushing them forward with desperate speed. "There!" Holt shouted suddenly, pointing ahead where a faint light indicated an opening to the outside world. As they stumbled out onto a snowy ledge halfway down the mountainside, the final section of tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing the mine forever. The three stood gasping in the cold mountain air, covered in dust and small injuries, but miraculously alive. Silas Tucker was nowhere to be seen, having presumably fled when the tremors began. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. "We made it," Deputy Holt breathed, placing his hands on his knees as he struggled to catch his breath. Sheriff Blackwood turned to check on Martha, only to find her staring at the crystal still clutched in his hand, her expression unreadable. "It's not over," she said softly. "They're still whispering. Can't you hear them?" And in the silence of the mountain twilight, with the wind whistling through the canyon below, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood realized with dawning horror that he could indeed hear them. Faint, indistinct voices calling his name from somewhere deep within his own mind. Leave a comment below with the words, "What would you do if you heard whispers calling you from an abandoned mine?" I'm eager to hear your thoughts on what you might do in this situation. The journey back to Silver Gulch was slow and arduous. Martha Holloway walked between the sheriff and his deputy like a sleepwalker, her eyes fixed on distant mountains, responding to questions with disjointed phrases that made little sense. The crystal remained in Sheriff Blackwood's coat pocket, where he could feel its unnatural warmth through the fabric. They reached town well after midnight, the streets deserted save for a few oil lamps burning in windows. Dr. Detath. Merritt was summoned from his bed to examine Martha at the small jailhouse, the only secure building in town where they could ensure she wouldn't wander off. Physically, she's suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, the doctor reported after his examination, speaking quietly to the sheriff in the outer office while Deputy Holt kept watch over Martha in the single cell. But her mental state, he shook his head. I've seen similar cases in mining towns. Isolated individuals who begin to hear or see things that aren't there. Usually, it's the result of toxic gases in poorly ventilated mines or simply the psychological effects of prolonged solitude. "This is different," the sheriff insisted, thinking of the strange chamber, the altar, the voices that had seemed to come from the very stone. She was exposed to something in that mine, something that affected her mind. "Doctor," Merritt gave him a concerned look. "And you believe you were exposed to it as well?" The sheriff hesitated, his hand unconsciously moving to the pocket where the crystal rested. "I'm fine. My concern is for Mrs. Holloway's recovery. With rest, proper nutrition, and time away from isolation, she may improve," the doctor said, though his tone suggested limited optimism. "I can prepare a sedative that will help her sleep. Beyond that," he spread his hands in a gesture of medical limitation. After the doctor left, Sheriff Blackwood returned to the cell where Martha sat on the narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the opposite wall. "Mrs. Holloway," he said gently, "is there anyone I can contact for you? Any family who might come and help during your recovery?" Martha turned to him slowly, her gaze sharpening with momentary clarity. "You have it, don't you? You took it from the altar." The sheriff didn't answer. "They'll want it back," she continued. "They've waited so long, you see. Centuries in the darkness, watching through stone eyes as civilizations rose and fell. My husband found them by accident, drilling where no drill should go. They took his voice first, used it to call to me." A tear slid down her cheek. "I thought I was following James home." "Martha," the sheriff said carefully, "what you experienced in the mine, it wasn't real. There were no ancient beings, no voices. It was likely gas from the deeper chambers affecting your mind." She smiled sadly. "You have it in your pocket right now, don't you? And you've already heard them whispering your name. That's why you can't bring yourself to throw it away or smash it underfoot. They're already inside your mind, Sheriff." Blackwood felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He hadn't told anyone about the whispers he'd begun to hear. "Rest now," he said, retreating from the cell. "Doctor, Merritt will return with something to help you sleep." Outside in the office, Deputy Holt was preparing for the night watch. "I'll stay with her, Sheriff. You should get some rest yourself." Blackwood nodded gratefully. "Wake me if there's any change in her condition." He hesitated at the door. "And Holt, don't listen too closely if she starts talking about voices or whispers. Whatever affected her in that mine, just be cautious." The deputy touched the cross he wore around his neck. "Don't worry about me, Sheriff. I know evil when I sense it." Blackwood walked through the silent town to his small house at the edge of Silver Gulch. The night was clear now, stars brilliantly visible above the mountain peaks. He could see the outline of the ridge where the Whispering Mine entrance had been, now collapsed and sealed forever. Inside his home, he lit a lamp and sat heavily at his kitchen table. Exhaustion pulled at him, but he knew sleep would not come easily, not with the weight in his pocket and the faint sounds at the edge of his hearing. Slowly, he withdrew the crystal from his pocket and placed it on the table before him. In the lamplight, it looked almost ordinary, a clear quartz formation, unremarkable except for the swirling movement within it, like smoke trapped in glass. "What are you?" he whispered. The crystal pulsed once, a subtle illumination from within, and the whispering began again. Not audible, not quite, but present in his mind nonetheless. Words and languages he didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. Promises of knowledge, of power, of secrets buried in the earth since before human history began. Sheriff Blackwood sat there until dawn, listening to the whispers, unable to look away from the gentle movement within the crystal. When the first light of morning touched the window, he finally placed the object in a small wooden box, locked it, and hid the key. He would return to check on Martha Holloway, he decided. He would ensure her recovery and convince himself and everyone else that what had happened in the mine was nothing more than a tragic case of delusion brought on by grief and isolation. But even as he made these plans, a part of him knew he would open the box again when night fell. The whispers had promised to show him wonders hidden in the deep places of the world. And Thomas Blackwood, a man who had always prided himself on his rationality, found that he very much wanted to see them. When he returned to the jailhouse, he found Deputy Holt asleep at his desk and the cell door standing open. Martha Holloway was gone. "Holt!" he shouted, shaking the deputy awake. "What happened? Where is she?" The deputy came to consciousness with confusion, then horror, as he realized the cell was empty. "I checked on her at dawn, Sheriff. She was sleeping peacefully. I only closed my eyes for a moment, I swear it." A quick search of the jailhouse revealed nothing. The outer door was still locked from the inside, the windows secured. "It's impossible," Holt insisted. "She couldn't have left without me seeing or hearing her." But Martha was indeed gone, as completely as if she had vanished into thin air. A search of the town yielded no trace of her. No one had seen her leave the jailhouse. No tracks led away from the building and the fresh dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Blackwood had organized search parties to comb the surrounding hills. He himself led the group heading toward the collapsed mine entrance, driven by a certainty he couldn't explain. As they approached the site where the mine had been, one of the searchers called out, pointing to a figure standing at the edge of the canyon that ran alongside the mountain. A woman in a dark dress, her hair loose in the wind. "Martha!" the sheriff called, spurring his horse forward. But when they reached the spot, there was no one there. Only footprints in the snow that led to the canyon's edge and then stopped abruptly, as if their owner had stepped off into thin air. Sheriff Blackwood dismounted, approaching the edge carefully. The canyon below was deep and narrow, its bottom obscured by shadow despite the afternoon sun. From somewhere in that darkness came a sound, the same melody without words that they had heard in the mine. "My God," one of the searchers whispered. "She jumped." But the sheriff knew better. Martha Holloway hadn't jumped. She had followed the whispers, just as she had before. And now they had led her somewhere beyond their reach. The search continued until nightfall, then resumed at first light the next day. No trace of Martha was ever found, not in the canyon, not in the surrounding wilderness, not in any of the neighboring towns where inquiries were sent. 2 weeks after her disappearance, Sheriff Blackwood officially declared Martha Holloway missing, presumed dead. Her cabin was locked up, her few possessions cataloged for the unlikely event that relatives would come to claim them. Life in Silver Gulch gradually returned to normal. The tale of the widow who had vanished became just another story told in hushed voices around evening fires, a mystery that joined the pantheon of local legends. But every night, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood would unlock the wooden box and listen to the whispers from the crystal. And sometimes, among the ancient voices, he would hear Martha Holloway singing her wordless melody, calling him to follow where she had gone. 1 month after Martha Holloway's disappearance, Silver Gulch experienced its first casualty connected to the strange events at the mine. Michael Jensen, a young man who had been part of the search party that discovered Martha's footprints at the canyon's edge, was found dead in his home. According to his distraught wife, Jensen had been experiencing nightmares and claiming to hear voices calling to him from the direction of the mountains. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Dr. Merritt privately confided to Sheriff Blackwood that Jensen's expression at the time of death had been one of absolute terror. "Whatever he saw in his final moments," the doctor said gravely, "it was enough to stop his heart." 3 days later, another member of the search party reported hearing singing coming from the canyon at night. By the end of the week, he too was dead, found at the bottom of a mine shaft in what was ruled an accident, though no one could explain why he would have entered an abandoned mine alone after dark. Sheriff Blackwood could no longer ignore the pattern. Something had followed them back from the whispering mine, something connected to the crystal that now rarely left his possession. Each night, the whispers grew more insistent, more comprehensible. They spoke of a doorway opened, of entities that had waited millennia for human minds receptive to their influence. Martha had been the first, but now others in Silver Gulch were beginning to hear them. The sheriff made his decision after the third death. Samuel Tucker, brother of Silas, found wandering in the snow, muttering about the ones beneath the mountain before succumbing to exposure. That night, Blackwood packed provisions, took his most reliable horse, and rode out of town before dawn, the crystal secure in his saddlebag. He followed the path up into the mountains, but instead of heading toward the collapsed mine entrance, he took a seldom-used trail that wound along the ridge overlooking the canyon where Martha had vanished. The crystal seemed to grow warmer as he progressed, the whispers more distinct. They were guiding him now, showing him the way just as they had shown Martha. By midday, he reached a section of the canyon that narrowed dramatically, its walls rising almost vertically on either side. Here, the trail descended steeply toward the canyon floor, a path that few travelers ever took, as it led nowhere of interest to settlers or miners. The descent was treacherous, loose stones sliding beneath his horse's hooves. Eventually, the path became too steep, forcing the sheriff to continue on foot, leading his nervous mount behind him. The air grew noticeably cooler as they reached the canyon floor, where a shallow stream trickled between moss-covered stones. The high walls blocked much of the sunlight, casting the narrow space in perpetual twilight. 1 month after Martha Holloway's disappearance, Silver Gulch experienced its first casualty connected to the strange events at the mine. Michael Jensen, a young man who had been part of the search party that discovered Martha's footprints at the canyon's edge, was found dead in his home. According to his distraught wife, Jensen had been experiencing nightmares and claiming to hear voices calling to him from the direction of the mountains. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Dr. Merritt privately confided to Sheriff Blackwood that Jensen's expression at the time of death had been one of absolute terror. Whatever he saw in his final moments, the doctor said gravely, it was enough to stop his heart. 3 days later, another member of the search party reported hearing singing coming from the canyon at night. By the end of the week, he too was dead, found at the bottom of a mine shaft in what was ruled an accident, though no one could explain why he would have entered an abandoned mine alone after dark. Sheriff Blackwood could no longer ignore the pattern. Something had followed them back from the Whispering Mine, something connected to the crystal that now rarely left his possession. Each night, the whispers grew more insistent, more comprehensible. They spoke of a doorway opened, of entities that had waited millennia for human minds receptive to their influence. Martha had been the first, but now others in Silver Gulch were beginning to hear them. The sheriff made his decision after the third death. Samuel Tucker, brother of Silas, found wandering in the snow, muttering about the ones beneath the mountain before succumbing to exposure. That night, Blackwood packed provisions, took his most reliable horse and rode out of town before dawn, the crystal secure in his saddlebag. He followed the path up into the mountains, but instead of heading toward the collapsed mine entrance, he took a seldom-used trail that wound along the ridge overlooking the canyon where Martha had vanished. The crystal seemed to grow warmer as he progressed, the whispers more distinct. They were guiding him now, showing him the way just as they had shown Martha. By midday, he reached a section of the canyon that narrowed dramatically, its walls rising almost vertically on either side. Here the trail descended steeply toward the canyon floor, a path that few travelers ever took, as it led nowhere of interest to settlers or miners. The descent was treacherous, loose stones sliding beneath his horse's hooves. Eventually, the path became too steep, forcing the sheriff to continue on foot, leading his nervous mount behind him. The air grew noticeably cooler as they reached the canyon floor, where a shallow stream trickled between moss-covered stones. The high walls blocked much of the sunlight, casting the narrow space in perpetual twilight. The sheriff's horse refused to go any further, pulling against its reins and whinnying in distress. Blackwood secured the animal to a sturdy tree and continued alone, the crystal now pulsing warmly in his pocket with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The canyon narrowed further as he walked, until the walls were close enough to touch on either side. The stream disappeared beneath the stones, and the ground sloped gently downward. Ahead, where the canyon made a sharp turn, the sheriff could hear it clearly now, Martha's voice singing her wordless melody. As he rounded the bend, the canyon opened into a small circular space, like a natural amphitheater carved from the living rock. In the center stood Martha Holloway, her back to him, her dress torn and dirty, her hair wild and tangled with leaves. "Martha," he called softly. She turned slowly, and the sheriff had to suppress a cry of shock. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken but filled with an inner light that was not quite human. When she smiled, it transformed her face into something ancient and knowing. "You came," she said, her voice overlaid with others, a chorus speaking through a single throat. "We knew you would. The heart called to you, as it called to me." "What has happened to you, Martha?" the sheriff asked, his hand moving unconsciously toward his gun. She saw the gesture and laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the enclosed space. "Your weapons mean nothing here, Thomas Blackwood. This place exists at the boundary between your world and theirs. Those who came before, who dwelled within the earth when humans were still learning to make fire, they have been waiting for minds that could hear them." The sheriff took a step backward, but found the passage through which he had entered mysteriously gone, replaced by smooth stone. "What do they want?" "To return," Martha said simply. "They were banished into the deep stone when your kind first began to spread across the land. They've been dreaming there, trapped in the earth's heart for countless ages. The mining operation broke through to their prison, creating a path, and now they've found vessels willing to carry their essence back into the world." As she spoke, the air around them seemed to thicken, shadows moving where no shadows should be. The crystal in the sheriff's pocket burned now, almost too hot to touch. "You brought the heart," Martha said, her eyes fixed on his pocket. "Give it to me, and I will show you wonders that no human has seen since the dawn of time." Sheriff Blackwood hesitated, his mind clouded with whispers that promised knowledge, power, visions of civilizations that had risen and fallen before recorded history began. "These deaths in town," he managed to say, fighting through the mental fog. "Jensen, Tucker, did you cause them?" Martha's expression softened slightly. "They heard, but were not strong enough to understand. Their minds broke under the weight of what they glimpsed. But you are different, Sheriff. You've carried the heart for weeks now, listening to its whispers, learning its language. You're ready to see what lies beyond." She extended her hand, palm up. "The choice is yours. Give me the heart, join us in the passage, and learn what humanity has forgotten. Or return to your small life in your small town, watching as more minds break under the weight of truths they cannot comprehend." The sheriff found himself reaching for the crystal, drawn by a compulsion stronger than his own will. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a strange calmness descend, as if he were watching himself from a distance. "What will happen to Silver Gulch?" he asked, his voice sounding far away even to his own ears. "Some will hear the whispers and follow," Martha replied. "Others will flee, spreading stories of a cursed town in the mountains. Eventually, Silver Gulch will be forgotten, reclaimed by the forest, its name appearing only in old maps and tales told to frighten children." "And what of us? What happens to Martha Holloway and Thomas Blackwood?" Her smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "We become the voices in the stone, the whispers in the canyon. We become the legend that persists long after our mortal forms have returned to dust." The sheriff stood at the precipice of decision, the crystal burning in his palm like a star. In that moment, he saw two paths stretching before him, one leading back to the world of men, of responsibility and order, where things made sense. The other leading into darkness and mystery, to knowledge that no human was meant to possess. He took a step forward, the crystal extended in his hand. 50 years later, in the spring of 1929, a young geologist named Robert Harmon made his way through the overgrown ruins of what had once been Silver Gulch. Little remained of the mining town, foundations reclaimed by forest, rotting timbers, the occasional rusted piece of machinery protruding from the earth like the bones of extinct beasts. Harmon was documenting abandoned mining settlements throughout Colorado's San Juan Mountains for the U.S. Geological Survey, photographing remains and collecting local accounts. Silver Gulch had particularly intrigued him due to the unusual circumstances of its abandonment, not a gradual decline when the mines played out, as was common with boomtowns, but a sudden exodus in the winter of 1879-1880. According to county records, nearly 2/3 of the population had left within a 3-month period, many abandoning possessions in their haste to depart. The official explanation involved rumors of geological instability following several unexplained tremors, But Harmon had found hints in old newspaper accounts and diaries suggesting something more peculiar. Multiple sources referenced voices in the canyon and the widow who followed the whispers. One journal, kept by the town's doctor, detailed a pattern of unusual deaths and disappearances, beginning with a woman named Martha Holloway and culminating with the unexplained vanishing of the town sheriff, Thomas Blackwood. Harmon had initially dismissed these accounts as superstition or the embellishments of frightened settlers, but standing now among the ruins, he felt an unease that his scientific mind couldn't rationalize. The forest here was unnaturally quiet, devoid of birdsong or the usual sounds of wildlife. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing against his ears with a subtle pressure that made it difficult to think clearly. His guide, an elderly man from a settlement 20 miles away, had refused to accompany him into the actual ruins, choosing instead to wait at their camp a mile distant. "That place ain't right," the old man had warned. "Folks around here won't go near it, especially not when the sun starts to set. Say you can hear singing coming from the direction of the old canyon, a woman's voice calling names that ain't been spoken in half a century." Harmon had smiled politely at this, as he always did when locals shared their folklore. But now, as afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the remains of what his map identified as the town's main street, he found himself glancing repeatedly at his pocket watch, calculating how long it would take to return to camp before darkness fell. As he was photographing the stone foundation of what appeared to have been a substantial building, the jail, according to his notes, a sound stopped him mid-motion. Distant, almost at the edge of hearing, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, singing a melody without words. Harmon froze, his camera halfway to his eye. The melody continued, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost familiar, though he was certain he'd never heard it before. Against his better judgment, he found himself moving toward the sound, away from the town ruins, and toward the narrow canyon that cut between the mountains to the east. The path was overgrown but still visible, winding through stands of pine and aspen. As he walked, the singing grew marginally clearer, though he still couldn't place its exact source. It seemed to come from the very air around him, or perhaps from the stone itself. The canyon entrance appeared before him suddenly, a narrow slash in the mountainside that the setting sun painted in shades of deep red. The singing was coming from within, echoing strangely against the high walls. Harmon hesitated at the entrance, scientific curiosity warring with instinctive caution. As he stood there, uncertain, the singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice, clear, feminine, and disturbingly close. "Another one who can hear us," it said, seeming to originate from just behind his right shoulder. Harmon spun around, but there was no one there, only shadows lengthening among the trees as the sun slipped lower behind the mountains. "Who's there?" he called, his voice tight with fear he was trying desperately to control. A laugh answered him, a sound both feminine and somehow wrong, as if multiple voices were laughing in perfect unison. "We've been waiting for new ears," the voice said, now seeming to come from the canyon itself. "It's been so long since anyone could hear us clearly." Harmon began backing away from the canyon entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I don't know who's playing this trick, but it isn't funny," he said loudly, though he knew with growing certainty that this was no human prank. "Not a trick, Robert Harmon," the voice replied, using his name with a familiarity that sent ice through his veins. "An invitation. We have such wonders to show you. Civilizations that thrived before your kind walked upright. Knowledge that was old when the first humans scratched pictures on cave walls." As the voice spoke, Harmon noticed something glinting among the stones at the canyon's entrance, something that caught the dying sunlight and reflected it with unnatural brilliance. Despite his fear, he found himself drawn toward it, kneeling to brush away dirt from an object partially embedded in the ground. It was a crystal, clear as glass but with something moving within it like smoke or fog. As his fingers touched its surface, it pulsed with a subtle warmth, and the whispering began. Not audible, but somehow present in his mind. Words in languages that had no names but which he somehow understood. "That's it," the voice encouraged, softer now, almost gentle. "Listen to the heart. It's been waiting for you, Robert, just as it waited for Thomas and Martha before you." Harmon's fingers closed around the crystal, lifting it from the dirt. It felt right in his hand, as if it belonged there. The whispers intensified, showing him visions of vast, cyclopean cities buried beneath mountains, of beings that had walked the earth when the continents themselves had different shapes. "Come into the canyon," the voice urged. "Follow where they led. Become part of something greater than your brief, limited existence." Harmon took a step forward, then another, the crystal clutched tightly in his fist. The canyon entrance seemed to widen before him, revealing a path that descended gently into shadows. From somewhere deep in his mind, a small voice of reason made one final attempt to be heard, reminding him of his camp, his research, the life and career waiting for him beyond these mountains. But it was drowned out by the chorus of whispers now filling his consciousness, promises of secrets and wonders beyond human comprehension. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Robert Harmon stepped into the Whispering Canyon, following the path that Martha Holloway and Sheriff Blackwood had walked 50 years before. Behind him, his footprints in the soft earth remained as the only evidence that he had ever been there at all. 3 days later, his guide would lead a search party to the ruins of Silver Gulch, where they would find Harmon's equipment and notes, but no trace of the geologist himself. His disappearance would become another chapter in the legend of the ghost town and its canyon, whispered in the settlements throughout the mountains. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right through the narrow passage between the peaks, those who dared to listen might hear 3 voices singing together, a widow, a sheriff, and a scientist, calling new listeners to join them in the darkness beneath the mountains. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more forgotten tales from America's past, and if this story resonated with you, please like and share it with others who appreciate the mysteries hidden in the dark corners of history.